Deep in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state, search teams moved carefully through dense forest. It was April 28, 2012, 6 days after a fire had claimed 2 lives and left investigators with more questions than answers. They were looking for something that seemed almost impossible. A bunker. A secret underground fortress that a man named Peter Keller had spent 8 years building without anyone knowing. When they finally found it, hidden beneath layers of earth and camouflage, what they discovered inside would reveal a truth more disturbing than anyone had imagined. This was not just a shelter. It was a window into the mind of a man who had been living 2 lives, one above ground, ordinary and unremarkable, another below, dark and methodical, planned in secret for nearly a decade. But to understand how this story ends in that hidden bunker, we need to go back to where it began, to a quiet morning in a small town, to a house fire that would expose secrets buried far deeper than any underground shelter. April 22, 2012, 8:45 in the morning, North Bend, Washington, a community of about 7,000 people, nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. The kind of place where neighbors know each other's names, where children play safely in the streets, where serious crimes simply do not happen. On this crisp spring morning, a man was taking his regular walk through his neighborhood when he noticed something wrong. Thin wisps of smoke were rising from a house at the edge of the residential area. His heart began to race as he realized what he was seeing. A house fire, and at this early hour the family inside might still be sleeping. He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed 911. Within minutes, fire trucks arrived at the scene. The flames had already grown beyond the initial wisps of smoke, spreading with the frightening speed that makes early morning fires so deadly. This was the home of Peter Keller, his wife Lynette, and their 19-year-old daughter Kaitlyn. But as firefighters arrived, there were no signs that anyone had escaped. No family standing safely on the lawn. No neighbors reporting that they had seen anyone leave the house. The rescue teams felt their hearts sink as they prepared to enter the burning structure. Firefighters pushed through the front door into a wall of thick, choking smoke. Visibility was almost zero. They moved carefully through the first floor, heading toward where the master bedroom would be, where the couple would most likely be sleeping at this hour. Every step was a battle against the heat and the smoke, inching forward through the haze, hoping they would find survivors. Then one firefighter's flashlight beam caught something in the darkness. He raised his hand, signaling to his team to stop. As the light cut through the smoke, 2 bodies became visible on the floor. Lynette and her daughter Kaitlyn. Both had been shot before the fire ever began. The firefighters continued their desperate search for Peter, but even after the flames were extinguished and the smoke had cleared, he was nowhere to be found. Had he been trapped somewhere in the debris? But as police investigators arrived and began examining the scene more carefully, they quickly realized this was no ordinary house fire. 7 gas canisters were discovered around the property. Plastic fuel containers sat melted on the kitchen stove. The patterns of burn damage told a clear story. This fire had been set deliberately. This was murder, followed by arson to cover the crime. And the husband, the father, the only member of the family unaccounted for, was missing. Then came the discovery that would change everything. In the ruins of the house, investigators found a fireproof safe. Despite the intense heat that had destroyed nearly everything else, the safe had protected its contents. Inside was a hard drive, miraculously undamaged. When police connected it to a computer and began reviewing the files, they found blueprints, detailed notes, supply lists, and dozens of video recordings. The most recent video had been recorded just days before the fire. When investigators pressed play, Peter Keller's face filled the screen. He was calm, almost casual, as he spoke directly to the camera, and the words he said would send chills through everyone who heard them. He said he was going to kill his wife and daughter. He said he would then go to his bunker and end his own life there. He talked about how it would be more interesting to live in the bunker, robbing banks and pharmacies for supplies, than continuing to live his ordinary life. The investigators stared at the screen in stunned silence. A bunker. He had built a bunker, and based on the blueprints and notes they were now reviewing, he had been working on it for years. The question that filled the room was simple but haunting. How had no one known? How had a man built an underground fortress while maintaining the appearance of a normal family life? And most importantly, where was this bunker? Where was Peter Keller right now? The search was about to become one of the most intensive manhunts in the region's history. But to truly understand what drove Peter to this unthinkable act, we need to understand who Lynette and Kaitlyn were, not just as victims in a case file, but as real people whose lives had meaning and value far beyond how they ended. Lynette Keller had been living in North Bend for years, quietly building a life centered around her family. She had worked for most of her adult life, taking pride in her career and contributing to the household income. But several years before that April morning, a workplace accident changed everything. The injury left her with a permanent disability, forcing her to leave the job she loved. For many people, such a setback might have led to bitterness or despair. But those who knew Lynette saw something different in her response. She adapted with a grace and strength that impressed everyone around her. Unable to continue her career, she redirected her energy toward what had always mattered most to her: her family, her home, the small daily acts of love that create a life worth living. Friends and neighbors described Lynette as someone who could find joy in simple moments. She loved cooking, often experimenting with new recipes and filling the house with wonderful aromas. She took pleasure in tending to her garden, watching plants grow through careful attention and patience. She had an infectious laugh that could lighten the mood in any room. But perhaps what defined Lynette most was her relationship with her daughter. As Kaitlyn grew from a curious child into a thoughtful young woman, Lynette had been there for every milestone, every triumph, every disappointment. The bond between them was something special, something that everyone who knew them could see and feel. Kaitlyn, at 19, was everything a parent could hope for in a daughter. She was attending college, pursuing her education with the kind of determination and focus that made her mother proud. Bright and ambitious, she had real plans for her future. She talked about her classes with genuine enthusiasm, engaging with ideas and challenges in ways that impressed her professors. Her friends described her as the kind of person who lit up any room she entered. She had inherited her mother's warm personality and quick smile. Kaitlyn was thoughtful in ways that stood out, even among young people. She remembered birthdays. She checked in on friends when they were going through difficult times. She made time for family even as her own life grew busier with studies and new experiences. That semester, she had been particularly excited about the courses she was taking. She would come home on weekends and tell her mother about what she was learning, about the professors who challenged her thinking, about the future she was beginning to envision for herself. Her path was not yet fully clear, but she was exploring it with energy and optimism. On weekends when she came home, mother and daughter would often spend hours together. Sometimes they watched movies, sharing a bowl of popcorn and commenting on the plot twists. Sometimes they just talked, catching up on the week's events, sharing stories and thoughts about everything and nothing. These moments were precious to both of them. The night before the fire, Kaitlyn had been looking forward to spring break. She had plans with friends, adventures she was excited about, but she also wanted to spend quality time at home. She loved her mother deeply and never took for granted these conversations, these shared laughs, these quiet moments of connection. In their final hours together, mother and daughter had talked quietly in Lynette's bedroom. It was supposed to be a special evening, a chance to reconnect after Kaitlyn's busy school schedule had kept them apart more than usual. They discussed small things, everyday things. Kaitlyn's upcoming exams, Lynette's plans for her spring garden, a funny story one of them had heard. Normal, precious conversations between a mother and daughter who loved each other. Neither could have imagined that these would be their last words to each other, their final moments of peace and normalcy. As they drifted off to sleep that night, they were simply a mother and daughter sharing time together under the same roof. Two people with so much left to experience, so many tomorrows they would never see. They could not have known that in another part of the house, Peter had already made his decision. The plan that had been forming in his mind for months, perhaps years, was about to become reality. While they slept peacefully, he was preparing to destroy everything they had, everything they were, everything they could have been. To understand how a man could commit such an act against his own family, we need to understand who Peter Keller was, or at least who he appeared to be. On the surface, he seemed unremarkable, ordinary even. He worked in information technology, a field that suited his methodical mind and preference for technical problems over social ones. He was quiet, competent, the kind of person who got his work done without drama or fanfare. Neighbors knew him as a polite man who kept to himself but was never unfriendly. He would wave when passing on the street. He helped carry groceries for an elderly neighbor once when she was recovering from surgery. He fixed a young boy's computer when it crashed, taking the time to explain what had gone wrong and how to prevent it in the future. By all outward appearances, he was simply a regular guy living a regular life. But beneath that ordinary surface, Peter had been harboring thoughts and making plans that no one around him could have guessed. His journey toward that terrible morning in April had begun years earlier. In the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, and during a period of economic uncertainty that had left many Americans feeling anxious about the future. Peter began spending more time online, reading about disaster preparedness, exploring survivalist forums, engaging with communities of people who believed that society was on the brink of collapse. The internet provided him with an endless stream of content that reinforced his growing fears. Every financial downturn, every political conflict, every natural disaster became evidence in his mind that catastrophe was inevitable. At first, his interest in preparedness seemed reasonable, even responsible. Many people stock emergency supplies or think about how they would handle a crisis. But for Peter, this interest began to evolve into something more consuming, more obsessive. He started to believe that he needed to do more than just have extra food and water on hand. He needed a real shelter, a place where his family could survive if civilization fell apart. In 2004, about 8 years before that April morning, Peter began exploring the Cascade Mountains, looking for the perfect location. He hiked trails, studied topography maps, searched for a spot that was remote enough to remain hidden but accessible enough that he could reach it regularly. Eventually, he found what he was looking for, a secluded area where he could begin building his shelter without drawing attention. He started construction on what he called his bunker. In those early days, his intentions seemed genuine. The initial design was for a family shelter with space for 3 people. He built sleeping areas for himself, Lynette, and Kaitlyn. He installed shelves for food storage, thinking about how to keep his family fed during a prolonged emergency. He brought in supplies gradually, piece by piece, so as not to raise suspicions about bulk purchases. Every weekend, he told Lynette and Kaitlyn that he was going hiking. They had no reason to doubt him. He enjoyed outdoor activities, and it seemed like a healthy hobby, a way to decompress from the stress of work. What they did not know was that he was not hiking. He was building, digging, reinforcing, slowly, methodically, creating an underground space that only he knew about. For the first few years, Peter maintained what seemed like a balance between his family life and his secret project. He still came home for dinner. He still attended Kaitlyn's school events when she was younger. He was present, or at least physically present, in the daily routines of family life. But something was shifting inside him, a gradual change that was hard for anyone to notice because it happened so slowly. He began to withdraw emotionally. Conversations with Lynette became shorter, less engaged. He spent more time alone in front of his computer, reading survivalist blogs and forums that reinforced his increasingly dark worldview. He started to see potential disasters everywhere, not just natural or economic ones, but social collapse, government tyranny, chaos waiting to erupt at any moment. The online communities he engaged with created what psychologists call an echo chamber. Everyone in these spaces shared similar fears, similar predictions of doom. No one challenged his thinking or offered alternative perspectives. Instead, they validated his paranoia, amplified his anxieties, and encouraged him to prepare for the worst. The more time he spent in these digital spaces, the more disconnected he became from the reality of his actual life in North Bend. Lynette noticed the changes, though she might not have understood their full significance. Her husband was becoming more distant, more preoccupied. When she tried to talk to him about it, he would dismiss her concerns or change the subject. She worried, but she also trusted him. They had been married for years. Surely if something was seriously wrong, he would tell her. Surely he would not keep secrets from his own family. But Peter was keeping secrets. Big ones. And around 2010, about 2 years before the end, something fundamental shifted in his thinking. The bunker, which had begun as a shelter for his family, started to transform into something else. An escape. A refuge not from societal collapse, but from his own life. He began making modifications to the bunker that did not make sense if the goal was still family protection. He reconfigured the sleeping areas to accommodate just one person. He adjusted his supply calculations to support a single individual for an extended period. He added more weapons and ammunition than would ever be necessary for simple defense. The bunker was no longer about protecting his family. It was about leaving them behind. In his video recordings, which police would later discover, Peter revealed the twisted logic that had taken hold in his mind. He talked about how his ordinary life felt like a prison, how his responsibilities felt like chains, how he fantasized about being free from all of it, living alone in his underground sanctuary, venturing out only to take what he needed through robbery and theft. In his distorted thinking, this sounded exciting, adventurous, more meaningful than his regular existence. He had stopped seeing Lynette and Kaitlyn as people he loved. Instead, they had become obstacles to the life he wanted, responsibilities he needed to shed, problems that needed to be eliminated before he could be free. The psychological distance he had been creating for years had grown into a chasm, so wide that murder began to seem not only possible but logical. What Peter was experiencing was what some psychologists refer to as catastrophic thinking taken to an extreme. He had become so focused on imagined disasters, on worst-case scenarios, on the supposed fragility of society, that he had lost the ability to engage with reality as it actually was. His relationships suffered because he could not be present in them. His work suffered because his mind was always elsewhere. His entire existence became centered on preparing for a crisis that existed primarily in his own imagination. And somewhere in that process, he made a decision. He would not wait for the world to end. He would end his own world first. He would kill his wife and daughter, burn down the evidence, and disappear into his bunker. Whether he truly intended to eventually commit suicide there, or whether he fantasized about some kind of fugitive existence, is unclear. What is clear is that he planned the destruction of his family with the same methodical care he had applied to building his shelter. The plan came together in the days and weeks before April 22nd. He made sure his supplies at the bunker were complete. He prepared the house for the fire, placing gas canisters strategically where they would cause maximum damage. He recorded his final video messages, explaining his actions to an audience he would never actually have, and then he waited for the right moment. That moment came in the early hours of April 22nd. Lynette and Kaitlyn were asleep. The house was quiet. Peter moved through the darkness with a gun in his hand, knowing exactly what he was about to do. The details of what happened next are important to understand, but difficult to relate with the dignity that Lynette and Kaitlyn deserve. Investigators would later determine that both women died quickly. There was no prolonged suffering, no drawn-out terror. In some small mercy, they likely never fully woke, never fully understood what was happening. They simply ceased to be. Their lives ended by someone who should have protected them above all else. After the shooting, Peter set the fire. He had planned it carefully, knowing that fire investigators would eventually determine it was arson, but hoping the flames would destroy enough evidence to buy him time. He made sure the fire would spread quickly through the house. Then he left, driving through the pre-dawn darkness toward the mountains, toward the bunker that had consumed so much of his time and energy, toward the hiding place he had spent 8 years creating. By the time the sun rose that morning and a neighbor spotted the smoke, Peter was already gone. By the time firefighters discovered the bodies and police began investigating, he was deep in the forest, following trails that only he knew, heading toward a location that no one else could find. The search for Peter Keller began almost immediately, but it started with a massive handicap. No one knew where to look. The Cascade Mountains cover thousands of square miles of wilderness, much of it dense forest and rugged terrain. Without knowing where he had built his bunker, police were essentially searching for a needle in a haystack the size of a small state. But the hard drive from the fireproof safe provided crucial clues. The videos and notes revealed that the bunker existed somewhere in the mountains. The blueprints showed its design and construction. Supply lists indicated how well provisioned it was, and buried in the digital files were small hints about its location. References to specific trails, mentions of landmarks, GPS coordinates that Peter had noted and then thought he had deleted. Digital forensics specialists worked around the clock to extract every piece of information from the hard drive. They recovered deleted files. They analyzed metadata from photographs Peter had taken at the bunker site. They cross-referenced his notes with topographical maps of the region. Slowly, painstakingly, they narrowed down the search area. Meanwhile, a massive search operation mobilized in the mountains. Police officers, sheriff's deputies, state patrol, and volunteers spread out across the most likely areas. They hiked trails, examined potential sites, looked for any sign of recent human activity in places where there should be none. Helicopters flew overhead, their crews scanning the forest canopy for anything unusual. Search dogs were brought in, though the vast area made it difficult for them to be effective. The search was complicated by the terrain and weather. The Cascade Mountains are beautiful, but unforgiving. Dense vegetation obscures sightlines. Steep slopes make travel difficult. Spring weather in the mountains is unpredictable, with sudden rain showers and fog that can reduce visibility to near zero. And underneath it all was the knowledge that they were searching for a man who was armed, who had already killed twice, and who might well be watching them from his hidden position. Days passed with no sign of Peter. 3 days. 4. 5. The search continued, but hope of finding him alive began to fade. Some investigators wondered if he had already carried out the suicide he had mentioned in his video. Others thought he might have fled the area entirely, that the bunker was a misdirection, and he had actually gone somewhere else. The case was dominating local news coverage, with updates broadcast several times a day about the search efforts. On the 6th day after the fire, April 28th, a search team was working through a particularly remote section of forest. The area was several miles from any marked trail, the kind of place where few people ever ventured. One of the team members noticed something that did not look quite natural, what appeared to be a small ventilation pipe barely visible among the undergrowth. The team approached carefully, weapons drawn, uncertain what they might encounter. As they got closer, they began to see signs that this was more than just a pipe. There was a concealed entrance, camouflaged so effectively that it would be almost impossible to spot unless you were looking for it. This was it. This was Peter Keller's bunker. The tactical team called for backup and surrounded the entrance. They announced their presence, calling for Peter to come out peacefully. There was no response. They announced again. Silence. Eventually, after following proper protocols and ensuring their own safety, officers entered the bunker. What they found inside was both impressive and chilling. The bunker was well constructed, clearly the product of years of work. There were reinforced walls, a ventilation system, sleeping quarters, and storage areas packed with supplies. Food, water, ammunition, weapons, tools, and survival gear were organized with military precision. Peter had built exactly what he intended. A fully functional underground shelter capable of supporting someone for an extended period. And there, in the sleeping area, they found Peter Keller. He was dead. He had taken his own life with the same gun he had used on his family. Based on the condition of the body and other evidence, investigators believed he had been dead for several days, possibly within a day or two of arriving at the bunker. The discovery brought an end to the manhunt but opened up new questions for the investigation. Forensic teams spent days examining the bunker, documenting everything they found, trying to understand the full scope of what Peter had built and planned. They photographed the layout, cataloged the supplies, and analyzed his journals and notes. The journals were particularly revealing. Peter had been documenting his work on the bunker for years, writing detailed entries about each stage of construction, each new supply cache, each modification to his plans. But more than just technical notes, the journals showed the evolution of his thinking. In the early entries, he wrote about protecting his family, about making sure Lynette and Kaitlyn would be safe if disaster struck, about being a responsible husband and father by preparing for the worst. But as the years progressed, the tone of the entries changed. He began writing less about his family and more about himself, his frustrations with ordinary life, his resentment of responsibilities, his fantasies about escaping. The later entries barely mentioned Lynette and Kaitlyn at all, except as obstacles or burdens. By the end, the journals read like the writings of a man who had completely lost touch with normal human emotion and connection. The investigation also uncovered Peter's extensive online activity. His browsing history painted a picture of someone who had gradually isolated himself in an echo chamber of extremist thinking. He had spent hours every day on survivalist forums, reading apocalyptic predictions, engaging with people who reinforced his paranoid worldview. He had watched videos about disaster scenarios, studied articles about societal collapse, and immersed himself in content that portrayed the world as a dangerous place on the verge of chaos. What struck investigators and psychologists who reviewed the evidence was how gradual the process had been. There was no single moment where Peter suddenly became dangerous. Instead, there was a slow drift away from reality, a progressive isolation from the people who cared about him, a steady erosion of his connection to normal life. And at each step along the way, the changes were small enough that they could be rationalized or overlooked. This is what made the case so disturbing to those who investigated it. Peter Keller was not some obvious monster. He was someone's neighbor, someone's coworker, someone who seemed normal on the surface. The revelation of what he had done and what he had been planning forced everyone who knew him to reconsider their assumptions about being able to identify dangerous people based on outward behavior. The psychological analysis of Peter Keller became a subject of intense study in forensic psychology circles. Experts examined his case as an example of what happens when someone becomes completely absorbed in catastrophic thinking, when fear of hypothetical disasters becomes more real than actual present circumstances, when isolation reinforces extremist beliefs until violence seems like a logical solution. Dr. Robert Hayes, a forensic psychologist who studied the case extensively, described Peter as suffering from a form of delusional thinking, where he had lost the ability to distinguish between genuine threats and imagined ones. The bunker, which began as a response to perceived external dangers, ultimately became a manifestation of Peter's own internal collapse. He did not just prepare for the end of the world. He created the end of his world, and then built a refuge from the destruction he himself had caused. The structural analysis of the bunker revealed something equally telling. Engineers who examined the construction found that the early work had clearly been designed for multiple occupants. The original layout, the ventilation capacity, the storage space allocation all pointed to a shelter meant for a family. But modifications made in the final 2 years showed a dramatic shift. The space had been reconfigured for single occupancy. Resources had been reallocated to support one person for maximum duration. The physical evidence supported what the journals had revealed. Peter had gradually abandoned the idea of protecting his family and embraced the idea of escaping from them. For the community of North Bend, the revelations about Peter Keller were profoundly shocking. How could someone live among them for years, participate in community life, seem so ordinary, while secretly planning something so terrible? The case shattered assumptions and forced difficult conversations about how well anyone really knows their neighbors, their co-workers, their fellow community members. Maria Santos, who lived just a few houses away from the Keller family, spoke to reporters in the weeks after the case was resolved. She described how Peter had helped her carry groceries when she was recovering from surgery, how he had taken the time to fix her son's computer when it crashed, how he had seemed like a decent, helpful neighbor. She struggled to reconcile that person with what she had learned about him. "You think you can tell," she said. "You think dangerous people must look different or act different." But Peter was just Peter. He was quiet, but lots of people are quiet. He kept to himself, but that does not make someone a murderer. How are we supposed to know? How are we supposed to see what is hidden so completely? These questions haunted the entire community. Parents wondered if they had failed to protect Kaitlyn somehow, if there had been signs they should have noticed. Co-workers of Peter questioned whether they had missed warning signals. Lynette's friends felt guilty that they had not intervened more forcefully when she mentioned that her husband seemed distant. But the truth, as difficult as it was to accept, was that Peter had been extraordinarily effective at hiding his true thoughts and intentions. The double life he maintained was built on years of practice at concealing his inner world. He had learned to say the right things, to perform the role of a normal person, while privately descending into a psychological space that no one around him could access or understand. The case prompted significant changes in how the North Bend Police Department and other local agencies approached certain situations. New protocols were established for conducting welfare checks and recognizing signs of domestic isolation. Training was provided on identifying warning signs of extreme thinking and catastrophic ideation. Partnerships were formed with mental health professionals to ensure that resources were available for families dealing with stress, isolation, or concerning behavioral changes. Local community organizations launched initiatives aimed at reducing social isolation, particularly among men facing economic pressure or life transitions. Churches and civic groups created support networks designed to reach individuals who might be withdrawing from social connections. The goal was to ensure that no one else would suffer in silence the way Peter Keller had, with such devastating consequences for innocent people. The broader lessons of the case resonated beyond North Bend. Mental health professionals across the country studied what had happened, looking for insights that could help prevent similar tragedies. The case became a teaching example in discussions about the dangers of online radicalization, the psychology of catastrophic thinking, and the importance of maintaining human connection as a protective factor against extremist beliefs. One insight that emerged from multiple experts was the critical role that isolation played in Peter's deterioration. When he was more connected to his family and community, when he had regular social interactions that challenged his thinking, his paranoid ideas remained somewhat contained. But as he withdrew into himself and into online echo chambers, those ideas grew unchecked until they completely dominated his worldview. This understanding led to practical recommendations. Reach out to people who seem to be withdrawing. Do not assume that someone who appears functional on the surface is doing fine internally. Create opportunities for genuine human connection. Challenge extremist thinking when you encounter it, rather than letting it go unopposed. These simple actions, applied broadly across a community, can potentially prevent individuals from spiraling into the kind of isolation that consumed Peter Keller. For Lynette's extended family and friends, for Kaitlyn's former classmates and professors, the loss was immeasurable. 2 lives full of promise and potential had been erased by someone who should have been their protector. The grief was compounded by the senselessness of it all. There was no noble cause, no higher purpose, no explanation that could make their deaths mean anything. They died because one man had lost his connection to reality and basic human decency. Memorial services were held for both women. Friends and family shared memories of Lynette's warmth and resilience, of Kaitlyn's bright future and kind heart. People spoke about the everyday moments that make a life meaningful, the laughter shared over dinner, the quiet conversations on difficult days, the small acts of love and care that build bonds between people. These were the things that Peter had thrown away. These were the things he had destroyed. The bunker itself became a focal point for understanding what had gone so wrong. After the investigation was complete, authorities made the decision to permanently seal it. The entrance was collapsed, the ventilation shafts filled in, the site restored as much as possible to its natural state. There was discussion about whether it should be left as some kind of reminder or warning. But ultimately, the decision was made that the bunker served no positive purpose. It was a monument to a terrible mistake, and the world was better off without it. But while the physical bunker could be sealed and forgotten, the lessons it represented could not be so easily buried. The case of Peter Keller remained in the collective memory of North Bend, and in the professional literature of criminal psychology. It stood as a reminder of how ordinary people can harbor extraordinary secrets, how isolation can poison even the deepest relationships, how unchecked fear and paranoia can lead to unthinkable acts. Perhaps the most difficult aspect of the case for many people to accept was the realization that Peter had choices at every step. He chose to withdraw rather than connect. He chose to embrace fear rather than hope. He chose to plan violence rather than seek help. He chose to destroy his family rather than face his own psychological struggles. These were active decisions, made over years, each one bringing him closer to that terrible morning in April. There were opportunities for intervention that were missed, not because people were negligent, but because Peter was so adept at hiding his inner turmoil. But that does not mean intervention was impossible. If mental health resources had been more readily available and less stigmatized, Peter might have sought help. If the online communities he engaged with had challenged rather than reinforced his thinking, he might have reconsidered his path. If family or friends had pushed harder when they noticed changes in his behavior, he might have opened up about his struggles. These are not criticisms of anyone who knew Peter or Lynette or Kaitlyn. They are observations about how society as a whole can do better at supporting people in crisis, at recognizing warning signs, at creating environments where seeking help is seen as strength rather than weakness. The tragedy of the Keller family is that it was preventable, not through any single heroic action, but through the collective effort of a community that values connection over isolation, that prioritizes mental health, that refuses to look away from uncomfortable truths. As we reflect on this case years later, certain truths emerge clearly. Peter Keller's story began not with a moment of madness, but with a choice to separate himself from the people who cared about him. His descent was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, but each step away from human connection made the next step easier. By the time he was living almost entirely in his own head, consumed by fantasies of disaster and escape, the distance between him and reality had grown too vast to cross. The bunker he spent 8 years building was supposed to represent safety and security. Instead, it became a symbol of the isolation that destroyed him and his family. It was a physical manifestation of his desire to hide from the world, to escape from the responsibilities and connections that make us human, and in the end, it became his tomb. But this story is not really about Peter Keller or his bunker. It is about Lynette, who adapted to disability with grace and found joy in simple moments with her daughter. It is about Kaitlyn, who was building a future full of promise and possibility. It is about the years they should have had together, the memories they should have made, the love they should have been able to share. Their lives mattered. Their losses leave holes that can never be filled. They deserved so much better than what Peter gave them. They deserved to be protected, to be valued, to be allowed to live out their days in peace. They deserved a husband and father who would choose connection over isolation, who would seek help rather than plan destruction, who would value their lives above his own twisted fantasies. The community of North Bend carries their memory forward. The changes made in the wake of this tragedy, the increased awareness of mental health issues, the stronger connections between neighbors, these are living tributes to what was lost. They represent a commitment to ensuring that no other family suffers the same fate. For those of us who study these cases, who try to understand how and why they happen, the Peter Keller case offers crucial insights. It shows us that warning signs exist even when they are subtle, that isolation is dangerous, even when it looks like simple introversion, that preparation for disaster can become an obsession that creates the very catastrophe it claims to protect against, that online echo chambers can reinforce destructive thinking until it seems normal, that small interventions, made early, can potentially change the trajectory of a life spiraling toward violence. The clues were there, faded perhaps, hidden beneath the surface of everyday life, but present nonetheless. In Peter's gradual withdrawal from family activities, in his increasing preoccupation with disaster scenarios, in his shift from shared planning to secretive preparation, in his emotional distance from the people who should have been closest to him. These signs might have told a different story if someone had recognized their significance, if someone had reached out, if someone had intervened before it was too late. That is why we tell these stories, not to sensationalize tragedy or to satisfy morbid curiosity, but to illuminate human truths that might help us recognize similar situations in our own lives and communities, to help ensure that other families do not suffer what the Kellers suffered, to honor the memory of victims by learning from their losses. In every case we examine, in every story we explore, we search for those faded clues that might have changed everything. We look for the moments where intervention was possible, where a different choice could have been made, where tragedy might have been averted, because sometimes understanding the past is the only way to protect the future. Time passes, evidence fades, memories become less sharp, but the truth has a way of emerging, of making itself known to those who care enough to look for it. The truth about Peter Keller is that he was not a monster who appeared fully formed. He was a human being who made terrible choices, who allowed fear and isolation to consume him, who prioritized his own dark fantasies over the lives of innocent people he should have loved and protected. The truth about Lynette and Kaitlyn is that they were real people with hopes and dreams, with love to give and lives to live. They were not just victims in a case file. They were a mother and daughter who deserved decades more together, who deserved to see springs turn to summers, who deserved to make new memories and share new experiences. They were robbed of all that by someone who should have been their greatest protector. The bunker in the Cascade Mountains is gone now, sealed and reclaimed by the forest. But its lessons remain. Isolation kills, connection saves, fear unchecked becomes paranoia, paranoia unchecked becomes delusion, and delusion unchecked can lead to the destruction of everything good and beautiful in a person's life. We must remain vigilant for these signs in ourselves and in those around us. We must choose connection over withdrawal. We must ask for help when we need it and offer help when we see others struggling. We must challenge destructive thinking rather than letting it fester in silence. We must remember that we are stronger together than we are alone, and that the things we fear most often exist primarily in our own minds. Peter Keller believed his only escape was through violence and death. He was wrong. There were other paths available to him, other choices he could have made, other endings this story could have had. Professional help was accessible. Family members would have listened. Community resources existed. He chose not to use any of them. He chose destruction instead. That choice took 2 innocent lives and destroyed countless others through grief and trauma. It left a community shocked and questioning. It created ripples of pain that spread far beyond one house, on one street in one small town. And it left behind a bunker in the mountains, a dark monument to what happens when we allow ourselves to become disconnected from our shared humanity. This is Faded Clues, where we follow the traces of truth that others have left behind, hoping that in understanding their stories, we might write better endings for our own. The story of Peter Keller, Lynette Keller, and Kaitlyn Keller is now part of that record. A story of love and loss, of secrets and lies, of choices made and futures stolen. A story that ended in tragedy but offers lessons for the living. We remember Lynette and Kaitlyn not for how they died, but for how they lived, for the warmth they brought to the world, for the love they shared, for the potential that was stolen from them. Their lives mattered, their losses matter, and their story, difficult as it is to tell, matters too. Because in remembering them, in learning from what happened, we honor their memory and perhaps help prevent future tragedies. The bunker is sealed. The case is closed, but the conversation continues. About isolation and connection. About mental health and community support. About recognizing warning signs and intervening before it is too late. These are conversations worth having, lessons worth learning, truths worth understanding. And so we tell their story. Not as entertainment, but as education. Not as spectacle, but as remembrance. Not to glorify violence, but to honor victims and learn from tragedy. This is what Faded Clues is about. Following the truth wherever it leads. Understanding the past to protect the future. And never forgetting that behind every case, every crime, every headline, there are real human beings whose lives had value, and whose losses leave permanent scars on those left behind. May Lynette and Kaitlyn rest in peace. May their memory be a blessing. And may their story help us all be more vigilant, more connected, and more committed to supporting those around us who may be struggling in silence.